The mahogany doors of Whitmore and Associates law firm closed behind David Sanders with the finality of a coffin lid. Rain drummed against the tall windows of the 19th floor hallway, each drop a tiny percussion against glass that cost more than his monthly rent. He stood there, briefcase in hand, empty except for a single manila folder, and tried to remember how to breathe. The carpet beneath his feet was plush, absorbing sound, absorbing presence, absorbing the last shreds of hope he'd carried into that conference room 43 minutes ago. Preparing and narrating this type of story takes a lot of time and effort. If you like the story, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. If you want to watch every story of our channel, turn on the bell icon. Inside that room, his cousins had walked away millionaires. Trevor got the beachfront property in Malibu, worth at least $4 million. Cassandra received the investment portfolio, carefully curated over decades, valued at $6 million. Even Marcus, who hadn't visited their grandfather in 5 years, inherited the vintage car collection and the downtown commercial building that generated $70,000 in rental income monthly. They'd signed their papers with fountain pens, laughing about vacation plans and early retirements. Trevor had clapped Marcus on the shoulder. Cassandra had already made a call to her financial advisor before leaving the conference table. David got a key, not a metaphorical key to success or a symbolic key to the family legacy. An actual, physical, brass key with a worn grip and a number stamped into the bow. 42. It came with a handwritten note in his grandfather's shaky script. For David, the attic, trust the dust. That was it. No explanation from the lawyers. No additional documentation. Just sympathetic looks from the junior associate who'd handed him the envelope, as if she were delivering a cancer diagnosis rather than an inheritance. The elevator descended in silence. David watched the numbers tick downward, each floor a measure of his sinking stomach. Ground level arrived with a soft chime that sounded almost apologetic. The lobby of the building smelled like leather and old money, scents he'd never be able to afford now. Security guards nodded at him with practiced neutrality. They probably saw this every day. Families torn apart by wills, fortunes divided, hopes crushed under the weight of legal language. Outside, Seattle's autumn rain soaked through his jacket within seconds. He hadn't brought an umbrella. He never remembered umbrellas, one of those small life failures that his ex-wife used to point out with increasing frequency before she left. The crosswalk signal blinked red. Cars passed in wet swooshes of sound and spray. Across the street, through the coffee shop window, he could see people on laptops, living their normal lives, unaware that someone's entire world had just collapsed on the 19th floor of the glass building behind him. His phone buzzed. A text from Trevor. Drinks tonight to celebrate? My treat. Faced with tears of joy, David deleted it without responding. The bus stop offered minimal shelter. Water dripped from the overhang, creating a curtain between David and the rest of the city. An elderly woman sat on the bench, her grocery bags gathered around her feet like fabric children. She glanced at him, then away, respecting the universal code of public misery. The bus arrived 7 minutes late, hydraulics hissing as it lowered to the curb. David climbed aboard, tapped his transit card, and found a seat near the back where the heater didn't quite reach. The key felt heavy in his pocket. He pulled it out, turning it over in his palm. The metal was warm from his body heat. Number 42. His grandfather's house had an attic. He remembered it vaguely from childhood visits. A dusty space filled with Christmas decorations and old furniture nobody wanted to throw away but nobody wanted to use. He'd been up there exactly once, maybe 25 years ago when he was 7 or 8. His grandfather had sent him to fetch something. What was it? A box of ornaments? A photo album? The memory was soft around the edges, worn smooth by time. Trust the dust. What the hell did that mean? The bus jerked to a stop at Madison Street. David watched a young couple board, the man holding the door for the woman, both of them laughing about something private and warm. They found seats together near the front. The woman rested her head on the man's shoulder. David looked away, staring instead at his own reflection in the dark window. 34 years old. Thinning brown hair he kept meaning to do something about. Eyes that used to be described as thoughtful but now just looked tired. A jaw that needed shaving. When had he become this person? When had he become the kind of man who got left nothing while everyone else got everything? His phone buzzed again. Cassandra this time. "David, I know you're upset, but Grandpa had his reasons. Let's talk soon." He turned the phone face down on his thigh. The reasons. Everyone always had reasons. His grandfather had reasons for dividing his empire among the golden grandchildren while leaving David with a mystery key. His ex-wife had reasons for leaving after 8 years of marriage. She'd listed them alphabetically in the note she'd left on the kitchen counter. His employer had reasons for the layoff 6 months ago. Market conditions, restructuring, nothing personal. Everyone had reasons that made perfect sense to them and absolutely no sense to the people they destroyed. The bus crawled through evening traffic. Outside, the city transformed in that particular way Seattle had at dusk. The rain catching light from street lamps and storefronts, making everything look both beautiful and melancholic at the same time. Pike Place Market was closing down for the night. He could see vendors packing up their flowers and produce. Their day's work reduced to empty tables and folded tarps. A street musician played violin under an awning, her case open for spare change, the melody barely audible over the sound of rain and traffic. David's stop came at Roosevelt. He disembarked into a neighborhood he'd called home for 3 years but never quite felt at home in. The apartment building was one of those modern constructions that tried to look industrial chic but mostly looked cheap. Exposed pipes painted copper, faux brick facades, windows too large for the heating system to handle efficiently. His unit was on the 3rd floor, number 3G, which he'd initially thought was funny because it sounded like a cell phone network. The key stuck in his apartment lock. It always stuck. You had to jiggle it just right, lift the handle slightly, then turn. Muscle memory took over. Inside, the space greeted him with its familiar emptiness. After the divorce, Michelle had taken most of the furniture. What remained was functional but sparse. A futon that served as both couch and bed, a folding table he used as a desk, a television on a cardboard box, kitchen cabinets that echoed when you closed them. The walls were still rental white. No pictures hung anywhere. He'd been meaning to make the place feel more permanent, but 6 months had passed and he still lived like someone planning to move out any day. He dropped his briefcase by the door and went straight to the kitchenette. The whiskey bottle was where he'd left it, tucked behind the mostly empty cereal boxes. He poured 2 fingers into a mug. He'd packed all the actual glassware in storage after the split, and drank it standing at the sink, looking out at the apartment building across the alley. Someone over there was cooking something that smelled like garlic and tomatoes. Someone else had their television on too loud. He could hear the canned laughter of a sitcom bleeding through walls and windows. The key sat on the counter where he'd dropped it. Number 42. His grandfather's house was across town in Laurelhist, one of those established neighborhoods where trees were older than most of the residents and property values existed in a realm beyond mortal comprehension. The house itself was a 1920s craftsman, meticulously maintained, with a garden that had been featured in Seattle Home and Garden twice. David had visited regularly as a child, Sunday dinners, holiday gatherings, birthday parties in the backyard where his grandfather would set up croquet and pretend to let the children win. But that was before his parents died in the car accident on I-90, black ice and bad timing, when David was 19. Before he'd gotten lost in grief and dropped out of University of Washington in his junior year. Before he'd spent 5 years bouncing between jobs that paid rent but built no career. Before Trevor and Cassandra and Marcus had all finished their degrees, joined the family business, networked at the right clubs, married the right people, and generally done everything that successful people do when they have support and resources and safety nets made of money and connections. His grandfather had always been kind to him, always asked how he was doing, always seemed genuinely interested in whatever odd job David was working at the time. But there was a distance there too, a quiet disappointment that lived in the spaces between words. David was the grandson who never quite lived up to potential. The one who'd received help with first and last month's rent but never managed to save enough to buy property. The one who'd been loaned money for the wedding but couldn't keep the marriage together. The one who represented what might have been but never was. And now this. A key. The attic. Trust the dust. David poured another finger of whiskey. Then another. The mug was half full now, which seemed appropriate. Half empty or half full, depending on your perspective, and David's perspective had been firmly in the half-empty camp for a while now. He pulled out his phone, ignored 17 notifications, and opened the Photos app. He scrolled back, months turning into years, until he found what he was looking for. A picture from his grandfather's 91st birthday party, 18 months ago. The photo showed the whole family on the back deck. His grandfather seated in the center, wearing his signature cardigan despite the summer heat. Trevor and his perfect wife Amanda flanking him on the left, their toddler son perched on Trevor's shoulders. Cassandra on the right with her fiancé, husband now, both of them tanned from some recent vacation to somewhere expensive. Marcus standing behind everyone, tall and confident, arm around his girlfriend of the month. And there, at the edge of the frame, slightly out of focus, was David. Alone. Smiling, but alone. His grandfather's eyes in the photo were already starting to show the dimness that would eventually lead to the diagnosis. Dementia. Progressive. Irreversible. The last year of his life had been a slow fade, moments of clarity separated by longer and longer periods of confusion. David had visited when he could, Tuesdays usually after his shift at the warehouse ended. They'd sit in the living room, and sometimes his grandfather would remember who he was and sometimes he wouldn't. On the good days, they'd talk about baseball or the weather or recipes his grandmother used to make. On the bad days, his grandfather would call him Robert, David's father's name, and talk about events from 40 years ago as if they'd happened that morning. David zoomed in on his grandfather's face in the photo. Even then, you could see something in his eyes. Knowledge. Intention. Like he was looking at all of them and seeing past the smiles into something deeper. The lawyers had said the will was written 2 years ago, before the dementia had fully taken hold. Which meant his grandfather had made these decisions consciously, had chosen to give millions to Trevor, Cassandra, and Marcus while leaving David with nothing but a key and a cryptic note. Why? The question sat in David's chest like a stone. He finished the whiskey, rinsed the mug, and set it in the dish rack to dry. Outside, night had fully settled over Seattle. The rain had softened to a mist that haloed the streetlights. In the apartment across the alley, someone turned off their television. The cooking smells had faded. Monday night was settling into its usual quiet desperation. Everyone preparing for Tuesday, for the endless repetition of work and worry that constituted adult life. David returned to the counter and picked up the key again. The brass caught the overhead light, glinting dully. Number 42. He turned it over, examining every detail as if the metal itself might reveal some hidden message. But it was just a key. Old, worn, ordinary. The kind of thing you could buy at any hardware store for a few dollars. Except it wasn't ordinary. It was the only thing his grandfather had left him, which meant it had to mean something. Had to unlock something worth more than real estate or investment portfolios or vintage automobiles. His grandfather had been a deliberate man, even in decline. Every action had purpose. Every word carried weight. He wouldn't have left David a key to nothing. Would he? David pulled out his phone and opened the message thread with his Aunt Linda, his father's sister, the one person in the family who still talked to him regularly. She'd been at the will reading, sitting in the back, not receiving anything herself but present as a witness and support. He typed, "Aunt Linda, do you know what's in Grandpa's attic?" 3 dots appeared immediately, showing she was typing. Then disappeared. Then appeared again. Finally, "Honey, I haven't been up there in probably 30 years. Your grandmother kept Christmas things up there, I think. And maybe some old furniture? Why?" He stared at the message, thumb hovering over the keyboard. "How did you explain that you'd been left nothing but a key while everyone else got fortunes? How did you put into words the particular species of humiliation that came from being the forgotten grandson, the afterthought, the one who raided a brass key and a note about dust?" He typed, "Just curious. Thanks." Her reply was instant. "David, I'm so sorry about today. It wasn't right. If you need anything, please call me." He didn't respond. Pity was somehow worse than indifference. At least indifference didn't require you to perform gratitude. He set the phone down and walked to the window, pressing his forehead against the cool glass. The city stretched out before him, thousands of lit windows, each one a life in progress, a story being written. How many of those stories included sudden inheritances? How many included cryptic messages from dead grandfathers? How many included standing in a crappy apartment at night, wondering if your entire life had been a mistake? The key was still in his other hand. He held it up to the window, looking through the circular bow at the city beyond. Through that small circle, he could see maybe 3 or 4 windows in the building across the alley. In one, a woman was doing dishes. In another, a man sat at a laptop, his face blue in the screen light. Ordinary people doing ordinary things, unaware they were being observed through the circle of a mysterious key by a man who'd just been told his life was worth less than his cousins' lives. "Trust the dust," he whispered to his reflection. The words sounded absurd spoken aloud. Trust the dust, like some kind of Zen koan or fortune cookie wisdom. But his grandfather hadn't been a Zen master or a fortune cookie philosopher. He'd been a businessman, a practical man who'd built a successful import company from nothing, who'd raised 3 children, who'd maintained a household and a reputation and a legacy that would now be carried forward by Trevor, Cassandra, and Marcus. Unless the thought arrived fully formed, slipping into David's mind like someone had opened a door he didn't know existed. Unless the real legacy wasn't the money. Unless his grandfather had known something nobody else knew. Unless that attic held something that changed everything. It was a desperate thought. The kind of thought that came from too much whiskey and too much disappointment. But it was also a thought that had roots, that grew from soil David recognized. His grandfather had been brilliant, had built an empire through careful observation and strategic thinking, had played chess like a grandmaster, always thinking 7 moves ahead. He wouldn't have left David a key to nothing. Not if he'd written the will while still in possession of his faculties. David checked his phone. 8:47 p.m. The house in Laurelhurst was empty now. His grandfather had died 3 weeks ago. The funeral had been last Wednesday. Overcast, appropriately solemn, with a reception afterward where Trevor had given a speech about legacy and family that had made David want to punch something. Since then, the house had sat vacant, waiting for the will to be read and the estate to be divided. The lawyers had the keys. The house would be sold eventually, once everything was sorted out. But right now, tonight, it was just sitting there, empty, waiting. And David had a key. David woke to the sound of construction, jackhammers tearing into pavement somewhere in the neighborhood, that particular 6 a.m. violence that defined urban life. His neck ached from the futon's inadequate support. His mouth tasted like old whiskey and regret. Gray light filtered through the uncovered window, casting the apartment in shades of depression. Tuesday. Another day in the endless sequence of days that had defined his life since the layoff. He lay there for a moment, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that looked vaguely like Australia, trying to remember if anything from yesterday had been a dream. But no, the key sat on the folding table where he'd left it, next to his phone and the empty mug that still smelled like alcohol. The will reading had been real. The inheritance, or lack thereof, had been real. His cousins were millionaires now. He was still exactly who he'd been yesterday. Broke, alone, and apparently worth nothing to the one person who was supposed to see value in everyone. The shower ran cold for the first 2 minutes. David stood under the spray anyway, letting the temperature shock wake him fully. His shampoo was almost gone. He'd been stretching it for a week, adding water to make it last longer, one of those small economies that defined his current existence. The bottle sat in the caddy next to a bar of soap worn thin and a razor he'd been using for too long. In the mirror, fogged but still revealing, he barely recognized himself. When had this happened? When had he become the kind of man who rationed shampoo and drank whiskey from mugs? There used to be a different David Sanders. One who'd had ambitions. Who'd started college as an engineering major with a 3.7 GPA. Who'd fallen in love with Michelle Chun in sophomore year during a study group for thermodynamics. Her laugh like bells. Her mind sharp enough to cut through his nervousness and find something worth keeping underneath. They'd gotten married too young. 23 felt reasonable at the time, but they'd been happy. Or he'd thought they'd been happy. Turned out happiness was harder to maintain than anyone mentioned in the vows. He dried off with a towel that had seen better days and dressed in his usual jeans from Target, a gray Henley that didn't show stains, boots that were comfortable if not fashionable. His work uniform, except he didn't have work anymore. The warehouse job had lasted 9 months. Before that, there'd been the bookstore 2 years. Before that, the coffee shop 18 months. Before that, a dozen other positions that paid bills but built no resume. He was a professional temporary employee, always hired, never retained. The kitchen offered limited breakfast options. Cereal, generic brand, the kind that came in bags instead of boxes, and milk that was 2 days past its expiration date but smelled fine. David ate, standing up, looking at the key on the table. In daylight, it looked even more ordinary. Just a key. Metal and memory, signifying nothing except his grandfather's final judgment. David wasn't worth the good inheritance. David got the mystery prize. David got dust. His phone showed 23 notifications. He scrolled through them with mechanical detachment. Trevor had texted 3 more times, each message more insistent. Bro, you okay? Don't be mad. It's not personal. Seriously, call me back. Cassandra had sent a long message explaining that she'd love to help him out if he needed anything. Maybe she could spot him, a few thousand to get back on his feet. Marcus hadn't texted at all, which was somehow more honest than the other 2 combined. David deleted everything and opened his job search apps. Indeed, LinkedIn, Glassdoor, the usual suspects. He'd been applying to positions for 6 months now. 67 applications sent, 12 responses received, 3 interviews scheduled, 0 offers made. His resume was a patchwork of short-term employment and unexplained gaps. His degree was unfinished. His references were people who barely remembered him. He was, in the language of the modern economy, unemployable. He spent the next hour applying to positions he knew he wouldn't get. Administrative assistant at a dental office, required experience he didn't have. Warehouse associate at a distribution center, night shift, worse pay than the last one. Customer service representative for a cell phone company. Must be comfortable with aggressive sales tactics. He filled out forms, uploaded his resume, wrote cover letters that tried to make his fractured work history sound like diverse experience, rather than chronic inability to keep a job. It was theater, performance art, going through motions because the alternative was admitting he'd already given up. At 10:30 a.m., he gave up. The key called to him. Not literally, David wasn't losing his mind, not yet, but it exerted a gravitational pull nonetheless. He found himself picking it up, turning it over, running his thumb across the number stamped into the brass. 42. The answer to life, the universe, and everything according to Douglas Adams. A joke for people who'd read Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. His grandfather had probably never heard of Douglas Adams. The number meant something else. Something specific. David Googled 42 meaning. The results were useless. The Douglas Adams reference? Some numerology nonsense. A basketball player's jersey number. He tried attic key 42 and got results about storage units and lockboxes. Nothing helpful. Nothing that explained why his grandfather had left him this particular key with this particular number to access this particular space. The house in Laurelhurst. He hadn't been inside since the funeral reception, and even then he'd stayed downstairs, avoiding the upper floors where memories lived. His grandfather's bedroom. The guest rooms where David used to sleep during those childhood visits, when the world was smaller and safer. The hallway with family photos documenting generations of Sanders. His great-grandparents who'd immigrated from Germany, his grandparents on their wedding day, his father as a boy standing proud with a baseball trophy, his own baby pictures, back when he'd represented hope rather than disappointment. The attic was accessible through the second-floor hallway, a pull-down ladder that descended from the ceiling. He remembered the smell. Dust and old wood and something else, something like time itself had a scent. His grandfather had sent him up there once to fetch something. David was maybe 7. The ladder had seemed impossibly steep. The attic impossibly dark. He'd been afraid but hadn't wanted to show it. So he climbed up with a flashlight, found whatever box his grandfather needed, and climbed back down as quickly as possible. His grandfather had thanked him, called him brave. That was the only time David could remember being called brave. Trust the dust. The phrase rattled around David's head all morning. He tried to distract himself with television, daytime TV, the kind that made you feel better about your life by showing you worse lives, but he couldn't concentrate. He tried reading a book he'd started months ago, something about a detective in Finland, but the words blurred together. He considered going for a walk, but the rain had returned, harder now, drumming against the windows with intent. By noon, he'd made a decision. He was going to the house. Not to break in, he had a key after all. His grandfather had left him a key. That meant he was supposed to use it. The lawyers probably wouldn't approve, but the lawyers weren't here and the house was empty, and David was tired of doing what people expected him to do. Following rules had gotten him exactly nowhere. Maybe it was time to stop following rules. He took the bus again. Different route this time, heading east toward the lake, toward the neighborhood where houses had names and driveways had gates. The rain made everything look blurred, like the city was crying. Other passengers sat in their own bubbles of silence. A woman with groceries, a teenager with headphones, an old man with a cane who reminded David painfully of his grandfather. None of them knew where David was going or why. None of them cared. That was the beautiful anonymity of public transportation. Everyone in transit, everyone going somewhere, nobody asking questions. The Laurelhurst stop was 3 blocks from the house. David walked slowly, letting rain soak into his jacket, feeling the cold seep through denim into skin. The neighborhood was exactly as he remembered. Immaculate lawns, mature trees, houses that spoke quietly of wealth and permanence. A jogger passed him going the opposite direction, barely visible through the rain. A car pulled out of a driveway, something German and expensive. This was where successful people lived. This was where his cousins would probably buy houses eventually, continuing the legacy, staying in the neighborhood, being the kind of people who belonged here. David had never belonged here. The house sat on a corner lot, set back from the street behind a hedge that needed trimming. His grandfather had always kept the hedge trimmed, but 3 weeks of neglect had allowed it to grow wild. The walkway was slick with wet leaves. The flower beds looked abandoned. The whole place had that particular sadness of a home waiting to be sold, where love had lived but no longer did. David didn't have a key to the front door, but he knew where his grandfather had hidden the spare, under the false rock near the side gate, a hiding place so obvious it was almost charming. He found it easily, the rock lighter than it should be, hollow. The key inside was dry despite the rain. He let himself into the yard, then around to the back door, which opened into the mudroom. The lock turned smoothly. The door swung inward with a soft creak. Inside, the house smelled like his grandfather. Not strongly, the scent was fading, but enough. Old Spice aftershave. Coffee. Something like cedar and paper. The smell of a life lived fully and recently ended. David stood in the mudroom, dripping on the tile floor, suddenly uncertain. Was this trespassing? Was he allowed to be here? The will had given him a key, but that didn't necessarily grant him access to the house itself. The lawyers would probably say he should wait. His cousins would definitely say he shouldn't be here. But they weren't here, and he was. He moved through the house slowly, relearning its geography. The kitchen with its vintage appliances that his grandfather had refused to replace because they still worked fine. The dining room with the table that could seat 12, scarred from decades of family meals. The living room with its fireplace and the leather chair where his grandfather used to sit and read the newspaper every morning. Everything was exactly as David remembered, except emptier somehow. The house had known it was going to be abandoned. It was already grieving. Family photos still lined the hallway to the stairs. David paused at each one, a museum tour of his own history. His parents' wedding. His mother radiant in white, his father young and hopeful. His grandfather shaking hands with some politician at a business event. Holiday photos spanning decades, Christmas trees and birthday cakes and backyard barbecues. And there, in a frame that had hung in the same spot for 20 years, was a photo of David himself. Age 8 or 9, wearing a baseball uniform, holding a trophy that was almost as big as he was. His grandfather stood next to him, hand on David's shoulder, both of them grinning at the camera. David had forgotten about that trophy. Forgotten about the season his grandfather had coached his little league team. They'd won their division, not because they were talented but because his grandfather had a gift for making kids believe they were better than they were. He'd taught them to look at failure as information rather than shame. To try again. To trust each other. That was the year David had loved baseball before he'd lost interest and moved on to other things the way kids do. His grandfather's hand on his shoulder in the photo looked protective. Proud. Like David was worth protecting. Worth being proud of. When had that changed? When had David stopped being someone worth investing in? Or had it changed at all? Maybe the key was his grandfather's way of saying something nobody else understood. Maybe the attic held an answer to questions David didn't even know how to ask. The staircase to the second floor creaked on the fifth step it always had. David remembered learning to skip that step when coming home late during the few summers he'd spent here in high school, before his parents died, before everything fell apart. The upstairs hallway was dimmer than he remembered. Light filtered through lace curtains his grandmother had hung 30 years ago. The air was still holding its breath. The attic access was in the ceiling at the hallway's end. A simple square hatch with a rope pull. David reached up, grasped the rope, and tugged. The hatch descended smoothly, ladder unfolding in sections until it touched the floor. Above, darkness waited. The smell of dust drifted down, rich and thick, exactly as he remembered. He climbed. The attic embraced David with darkness and dust. A cathedral of forgotten things where light struggled to penetrate. His eyes adjusted slowly, shapes emerging from shadow. Cardboard boxes stacked against walls. Furniture covered with sheets gone gray with age. Christmas decorations in clear plastic bins, wreaths and ornaments visible through clouded lids. An old dress form that had belonged to his grandmother, headless and ghostly in the gloom. The space smelled exactly as memory had preserved it. Wood and dust and time compressed into molecular form. David pulled out his phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam cut through darkness, illuminating particles suspended in air, millions of dust motes drifting in the light, disturbed by his presence after years or decades of stillness. Trust the dust. His grandfather's words echoed differently up here, in this space where dust was truth, where everything that had been stored and forgotten waited to be discovered or to decay, whichever came first. The attic ran the full length of the house, maybe 50 feet. Support beams crossed the space at regular intervals, and David had to duck beneath them as he moved deeper inside. To his left, stacks of old National Geographic magazines, their yellow spines creating a timeline back to the 1960s. To his right, more boxes, these ones labeled in his grandmother's careful handwriting. Thanksgiving decorations, Easter basket supplies, winter clothes, David, age 12. That last one made him pause. She kept his old clothes. Saved them for what? Grandchildren who never came? He'd been married 8 years and never had children. Michelle hadn't wanted them, and David had agreed because agreeing had seemed easier than having the fight. Near the far wall, beneath a small window that offered the only natural light, David noticed something different. A writing desk, not covered, not dusty, recently placed or at least recently used. It sat in a clear space, as if everything else in the attic had been pushed aside to make room for it. The desk was familiar, his grandfather's, from the home office downstairs. A simple oak piece with 3 drawers on the left side and a flat writing surface. An empty coffee mug sat on its surface. A desk lamp, unplugged. And next to the lamp, a wooden box about the size of a shoebox, latched but not locked. David approached slowly, as if the desk might vanish if he moved too quickly. His footsteps on the plywood floor sounded too loud. He reached the desk and stood there, flashlight beam playing across its surface, looking for signs of what this meant. Why would his grandfather have brought his desk up here? When? The lawyer said the will had been written 2 years ago. Had the desk been up here that long? Or had his grandfather climbed these stairs in the last year of his life, dementia already eating his memories, to set up some final piece of theater for a grandson nobody else valued? The wooden box called to him. Not literally, David maintained that distinction, but with the insistent pull of obvious importance. He sat in the desk chair, which creaked under his weight, and pulled the box closer. The wood was dark walnut, polished smooth, with brass corners and a simple brass latch. No lock, no key required. He could open it right now. But his hand hesitated. What if it was empty? What if this was his grandfather's idea of a cruel joke? Bring David up here, make him hope, then reveal nothing. Or worse, what if it contained something that confirmed David's worst fears about himself? A letter explaining why he'd been left nothing? A detailed catalog of David's failures and disappointments? His grandfather had been kind, but kindness and honesty weren't mutually exclusive. Maybe this box held the truth David had been avoiding his whole life, that he simply wasn't worth investing in. He lifted the latch. Inside, wrapped in cloth that had once been white but was now cream with age, was a book. Not a published book, a journal. Hand-bound, with a leather cover gone soft from handling. David lifted it carefully, unwrapping the cloth to reveal the cover. No title, no author name, just leather and brass corners matching the box. He opened to the first page. For David, because you were always the one who asked why. His grandfather's handwriting, stronger here than in the note the lawyers had given him. This had been written longer ago, when the disease hadn't yet stolen precision from his hand. David's eyes burned. He blinked hard and continued reading. If you're reading this, I'm gone. Good. I never liked long goodbyes. Your grandmother was better at those. She could stretch a goodbye into an hour-long production with tears and promises to call. I prefer the quick cut. So here it is. I love you. I'm proud of you. And I'm about to make your life very complicated. David laughed, a sound that came out more like a sob. That was his grandfather exactly. Direct, unsentimental, but warm underneath. He turned the page. I've left you nothing in the official will. Trevor gets the beach house. Cassandra gets the investment portfolio. Marcus gets the cars and the building. By the time you read this, they'll all be celebrating, and you'll be wondering what you did wrong. The answer is nothing. You did nothing wrong. They're getting what they expect because people who expect things need to be taught about expectations. The next page continued. You, David, never expected anything. Not after your parents died. Not after you dropped out of school. Not after your marriage ended. You stopped expecting the world to give you anything, which made you the only one I could trust with the truth. What truth? David turned the page urgently. The Sanders fortune isn't clean. Never was. My father, your great-grandfather, built it on lies, and I maintained it with careful distance from those lies. But lies don't disappear because you ignore them. They compound. They grow interest. And now they're about to come due. David's hands trembled. He read faster. In 1947, my father bought 20 acres of land north of Seattle. Paid next to nothing for it. The land belonged to a Japanese family, the Nakamuras, who'd been sent to internment camps during the war. When they came back, their property had been legally purchased by my father through a proxy. He paid a lawyer $200 to forge documents. The Nakamuras tried to fight it, but they had no money. David's heart hammered as he continued reading his grandfather's confession. The attic seemed to shrink around him, dust motes frozen in the flashlight beam like suspended judgment. The Nakamuras tried to fight it, but they had no money, no lawyers who would take their case, and a legal system that didn't care about Japanese families in 1947. They lost everything. My father developed that land, sold it in parcels, and made the fortune that became the Sanders empire. Every dollar we have traces back to that theft. The next pages detailed decades of compounding wealth. The original 20 acres sold for profits that were invested in other properties, businesses, stocks. His grandfather had traced every transaction with accountant precision, showing how 20 acres of stolen land had multiplied into the millions his cousins had just inherited. I discovered this 5 years ago, his grandfather wrote, going through my father's papers after selling the family business. Found the original documents he'd hidden, the forged deed, the real deed showing Nakamura ownership, letters between my father and the lawyer. I had two choices. Expose the truth and destroy everything, or stay silent and become complicit in the theft. I chose a third option. I chose you. David turned the page with shaking hands. In this box, beneath this journal, you'll find every document. The proof, the evidence, and you'll find something else. Contact information for James Nakamura, grandson of the family my father destroyed. He's been searching for this evidence for 30 years. He knows his family was robbed but could never prove it. Now you can give him that proof. The implications crashed over David like cold water. His cousin's inheritances, all of it built on theft. The beach house, the portfolio, the rental building. Everything traced back to land stolen from a family who'd already lost everything to internment camps. Trevor, Cassandra, and Marcus got the fortune. His grandfather continued. You get the truth. The question is, what will you do with it? You could destroy them. Take this evidence to James Nakamura, help him file a lawsuit, unravel every asset. Or you could stay silent, let them keep their millions, go back to your apartment and your job applications and your quiet life. I won't tell you which to choose. That's not my place anymore. But I will tell you why I chose you for this. David's vision blurred. He wiped his eyes and kept reading. You're the only one who understands what it means to lose everything. Your cousins have never struggled. They've never had to choose between pride and survival, between doing what's right and doing what's easy. But you have. You lost your parents. You lost your degree. You lost your marriage. You lost job after job. Not because you were incompetent, but because life kept dealing you impossible hands. And through all of it, you never became cruel. You never blamed others. You just kept trying. The next page held only one paragraph. That's why you get the key, David. Because you're the only one who might have the courage to unlock what should never have been locked away. The dust I told you to trust? It's the dust of time, covering crimes we pretended didn't exist. But dust doesn't erase truth. It just hides it until someone brave enough comes along to brush it away. Beneath the journal, David found a manila envelope. Inside, photocopies of deeds, letters with his great-grandfather's letterhead, legal documents stamped and notarized, and a single index card with a name, phone number, and address. James Nakamura, Seattle, Washington. David sat in the attic darkness, holding his family's shame in his hands. His cousins were probably celebrating right now, planning their futures with their millions, unaware that everything they'd inherited was built on theft and suffering. He could destroy them with a phone call, could finally be the one with power, the one who mattered, the one who changed everything. Or he could walk away, put the documents back in the box, close the attic, and let sleeping crimes stay buried. No one would know. His cousins would stay rich. The Nakamura family would never get justice. And David would go back to his apartment, his job applications, his quiet desperation. He pulled out his phone and stared at the index card. Trust the dust. His grandfather had trusted him with the truth because David understood loss. Understood what it meant to have everything taken away. The Nakamuras had lost 20 acres. David had lost his parents, his education, his marriage, his career, his place in the family. But the difference was clear. David's losses had been tragedy and circumstance. The Nakamura's loss had been theft, deliberate and calculated, by people who had the power to steal and the privilege to get away with it. His finger hovered over the phone's keypad. In the distance, David heard a car door slam. Voices carried up through the house, Trevor's laugh, Cassandra's higher pitch. They'd come to the house, maybe to start inventorying their new properties, planning what to keep and what to sell. They'd find him here eventually, in the attic, holding the evidence of their fortune's rotten foundation. David made his choice. He descended the ladder with the box tucked under his arm, the journal and documents secure inside. Trevor and Cassandra stood in the foyer, shaking rain from their expensive coats. They looked up as David emerged from the hallway, surprise flashing across their faces. David? What are you doing here? Trevor's tone carried accusation masked as concern. David held up the key. Grandpa left me something after all. Something worth more than money. He walked past them out the back door into the rain. Behind him, he heard them calling his name, confused and worried. But David didn't stop. He had a phone call to make, a truth to tell, and finally, after 34 years of losing, a way to help someone else win something back. The key to the attic had unlocked more than dust and memories. It had unlocked purpose. And for the first time since the will reading, David Sanders felt like his grandfather's grandson. Not because of what he'd inherited, but because of what he'd chosen to do with the inheritance nobody else had wanted. The rain soaked through his jacket as he walked toward the bus stop, but David barely noticed. He was already dialing the number, already preparing to speak the words that would change everything. "Mr. Nakamura? My name is David Sanders, and I have something that belongs to your family. Thank you for listening to this story about inheritance, justice, and the courage to do what's right even when it costs us everything. If this tale of hidden truths and difficult choices resonated with you, please subscribe to our channel. We bring you compelling stories every week. Tales of mystery, family secrets, moral dilemmas, and the complex choices that define our character.